welcome to Try This at Home. I'm Cliff Bumgardner.
And I'm Harrison Stewart.
This week we are talking about Mythbusters Season 1, Episode 2. Our myths are Vacuum Toilet, Biscuit, Bazooka, and the Leaping Lawyer. It first aired January 23rd, 2003. It is directed by Peter Reese, the man of land and sea. And I gotta say, before we even hop into this one, my overall thoughts, way better.
Yes.
I thought this episode was so much better than the first episode.
Yes.
It shocked me how much better it felt, considering that it was shot at the same time. It's just episode 2.
Right.
It wasn't there. Nothing major has changed. Immediately, I thought it was better. What about you?
I totally agree. I mean, especially since it was, I think we discussed last time that it is essentially a 3-part pilot.
Yeah.
They shot all 3 episodes, and it was wild to me how from episode 1 to episode 2, you seem to have a pretty massive leap toward what we would recognize as the standard format.
And I think the biggest change that really dictates that in this episode is that it's 3 myths and not 2. Because when you think about the show is whatever it was at that point, 44 minutes or whatever television, a television hour was for Discovery in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
When you think about it, you have the same amount of time no matter what. So either in the first episode, they're stretching 2 myths across that time. In this one, they're having to force 3, and it forced their hand. The pace is better. The information is better. The storytelling is better because I think it kind of had to be to make the edit work. And so even just that alone, I also thought it was cool. The myths are smaller. We don't have a rocket car. We don't have a big explosive myth in this. So they kind of had to make those smaller myths better and put more into them and really invest in them. And I just thought all the way throughout, there's still weirdness. Don't get me wrong. It is still, there's some early 2000s moments in this episode that blew my mind. But overall, definitely thought it was better. There was one myth, and we'll get there, that when the myth was introduced, I thought, this is so stupid.
Same.
I'm
pretty sure I know the one.
Why are we talking about this? And within a minute, when they got into the methodology and process, they turned me around.
Same.
I was immediately like, oh, I'm back in. This is great. This is awesome. So it was blown away by how much better it is being we're only, 1 episode removed from all the problems we talked about last week. Yeah. Before we even get to the actual myths, did you notice that Jamie's rollerblades came back?
Did I notice?
It's like the better take.
Cliff. I know.
We talked about this last week that they had this take in there, this clip of Jamie trying to introduce the show while falling down on drill-powered rollerblades. And in this one, they used the actual final take where he got it right.
Which is so funny. Because basic logic would dictate that the way that you would do that is have it, 1, in the same episode, but 2, you show the one that went right first.
Yes.
And then there's kind of like a blooper reel. Oh, yeah, but to just use it completely cold in the last one is magnificent. I agree. I agree with that decision right there. I loved it. And I did actually, when it played, I was like, that's cleaner. Is that the same? And I went back, I'm like, not the same clip.
Not the same clip. Mm-mm. He doesn't fall down this time.
No, he doesn't.
So our first myth, vacuum toilet, also known in this episode as stuck on you. And I have to just give a complaint as the logistical side of this podcast that between Max, IMDb, and the show itself, there is zero consistency in what anything is called. So if people are listening to this and they're confused, so are we.
Yeah.
Just going to put that out there right at the top because I have absolutely no idea why everything is I guess after 20 years, things get a little bit shifted.
That makes sense. Yeah. Perhaps some of them were filed physically a certain way. That's what it's starting to feel like.
We're coming from tape at this point.
Yep.
But this myth, the confines of the myth is that an overweight person was on a transatlantic flight and they flushed an airplane toilet while seated, and the suction actually stuck them to the toilet so fiercely that they could not pull themselves off until the plane landed and they had to be helped by the flight crew.
Fantastic.
And just to tee this off at the very beginning, because of the nature of this myth, Adam and Jamie had a hard time figuring out how to talk about it.
Big time.
And eventually
in a PG-13 way, a TV-14 way.
Yes, in an early 2000s Discovery kind of way. And what I love is that Jamie abandons any attempt to do that right away.
We have to create a large female posterior, is that how we
posterior, yes.
Yeah, a big ass.
A big ass.
You hear Adam trying to be so respectful. Yes, posterior, that is the correct term that we are. And Jamie just abandons it. Just nope, big ass.
Totally, right. Like he is corrected, like, oh, it's no R, just posterior. And he's like, right, a big ass.
Big ass.
I'm like, all right, well.
I have to say at the top, I wanted to address this, that when I pulled up this episode on IMDb to look at like the facts and the air dates and all that kind of stuff, there was a comment from somebody on IMDb, a review from someone who said, I'm a big fan of Mythbusters. I love the show, but I was disappointed in this episode by the level of humor, by the kind of 12-year-old boy joke, fat shaming kind of stuff. And I saw that before I watched the episode. And so I went in going, oh man, like what is, you know, what did they say?
How bad?
It's been 20 years. How bad is this going to be? Yeah. In all, I'd actually, maybe that had just set me up to feel that it was going to be worse than it is. I didn't think it was that bad, but I do think it's worth talking about just up at the top so we get it out of the way.
Yeah.
That there's definitely some jokes in here and some stuff that you wouldn't do now. And that probably if they had it back, they wouldn't do then. There's a Twinkies joke later on that's just kind of, it's not even a great joke. And it's just a little bit weird.
Yeah.
The amount of, you know, big ass fat shaming kind of butt talk that goes on throughout the episode.
Yeah.
I just wanted to address that at the top of like, yay, you know, it's been 20 years. I don't think it does anybody any good to beat up on them for it, but also probably would like to have that back.
Yeah. Yeah. And the super interesting thing about that to me is I did not notice it.
Really?
Not at all. I mean, it is ingrained in a lot of cultural language,
right?
Especially at this time. But it didn't register. But then once you said it, I could recall like that.
Yeah.
The moments, and especially when you brought up the Twinkie joke.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. I was more noticing the fact that the ass was big and not necessarily that it was attached to a presumably big person, and that was harped upon more than once. They
also kind of harp on the fact that it's supposed to be a big woman a lot, which I thought was a little bit weird. Like that doesn't matter. You know what I mean? Like that for the confines of the myth, like I don't mind that they're talking about a large person. Like that obviously is part of what would make this happen if it were to actually happen.
Right.
But it was weird that they very much harped on like, no, it's a woman, it's a big woman, it's a fat woman. They kind of kept saying that, and I just like, yeah, okay, you know, I get it, but also maybe we would take that back if we could. But in general, what was your expectation at the beginning of this? Did you have a guess or a thought when they introduced this idea?
I did. I said absolutely not.
Yeah.
I couldn't stop thinking about the episode of South Park where Craig like doesn't put down the toilet seat and his mom gets like stuck in the toilet. That was all I was thinking about. But I guess where I was mainly resting my opinion was just I would have heard about this.
Right.
You know, like like the very fact that I don't know the name of the person who this happened to.
Right.
Absolutely not. That this would have been a national news story. I mean, it's got all the ingredients. It's crude. You know, like it's kind of scary.
Yeah.
There's just no way that this wouldn't be a top story.
It reminds me a little bit about kind of how we talked about last week with Pop Rocks and Soda of at a passing glance, you can understand where a story like this comes from of like someone sitting down an airplane toilet, they flush it and go, oh, that feels weird. Like, cause there would be suction. There would be like a feeling that becomes a game of telephone. You tell somebody, they tell somebody, and it becomes this like, oh, you hear somebody got stuck, and then it just keeps growing and you keep making it bigger. So in that sense, like, the idea wasn't preposterous to me entirely, but definitely it seemed like, that like there's someone whose job is to make sure that doesn't happen. Because if people,
and we meet him.
we meet him almost immediately.
Yep.
Did you notice this man's name? Mark.
Is it Punny?
Pondalik.
Oh man. Come on now.
Pondalik.
Come on.
It's too bad he's not like an algae expert. That would have been even better.
That would have been even better. But honestly, being and I even wrote down in my notes, there's a leading authority on airplane toilets, question mark. Like the fact that is a position that someone set out and was like, I will know all there is to know about the topic of airplane toilets.
I feel like that. I feel like that's more a job you fall into. And you look up one day and go, I've become the world's leading authority in airplane toilets. I didn't think I was going to get here, but here I am.
See, I like to imagine that there was a Rocky style montage where he was training and then he gets to the top of the steps and like lifts a toilet above his head. And it's
He's just
like,
got a
it's
seat.
me. Yeah.
Eye of the tiger in the background who's just
Climbed Everest with a toilet seat around his neck. Absolutely.
While we're talking about the interview, we didn't even really talk about this last week, and I just want to get this out of the way. The interviews on this show are so weirdly shot.
Absolutely.
Every single interview is like people are framed to the side, and it's like it's old 4:3 to begin with. But
Yes.
but then it's like they're even cut off in the original aspect ratio.
Yeah.
It's so weird. In this one, when they're talking to this Mark guy, the toilet engineer, which didn't expect to be saying that in my life.
Here we are.
When they're talking to him, he's looking off frame through the side of the frame that's closest to his head at a toilet that you can't see in the shot.
Yeah.
So the whole time he's looking away from the shot, framed completely to the side. And they do that in every interview. They're all weird throughout the show. I don't know what the thought process was throughout the show, but I just wanted to say that to like cover us off on a few episodes, because if we talk about it every time, it's going to get annoying. But oh my God, every time an interview came up, I was watching this episode actually with my girlfriend, and every time an interview would pop up, she would just go, "What is happening?"
Yeah.
Like it's so strange throughout the whole show.
Yeah. It's like, why did the guy from The King's Speech direct this section? Like, that's an odd choice.
Like, is this proto Sherlock? What are they doing? This is really creative. I did think at the beginning of this myth right away, we talked about this last week and being surprised that it wasn't there. They started using the blueprints to really illustrate the process and what they were testing for. And I thought immediately it was better.
Yes.
Like immediately I understood more of what they were actually testing for and what the parameters were from the beginning. And it worked. Like right off the top, I felt like, oh, okay, I'm home. I understand what's going on.
Yeah.
Really surprised me.
I mean, it was a lot cleaner, and it was also, they seemed to, for instance, there was less of the folklorist.
Yes.
If she was in it at all.
She was in it a little bit.
A little bit. Okay. I mean, some of that is just got to be, like you were saying earlier, the fact that they did 3 myths this time.
Right.
But at the same time, she's great, but it allowed them to focus more on the process than all of the surrounding stuff about it, because they set it up, they gave us the story, and then they worked on it.
And I feel like it's almost less about seeing less of her and it's seeing less of everybody else. Because if she was just providing that folklore perspective, it would give you there's kind of, I realized that while watching the episode, and we'll talk about it particularly at the result of this myth, but like, I realized what they're trying to do that we talked about it a lot with Rocket Car, but it wasn't clear yet, was they're trying to do 2 things at once. They're trying to do this modern mythology, folklore, here are quote unquote real stories, and we're going to see if they're real.
Right.
And they're trying to do essentially like participatory journalism. Like we're going to try to recreate this and see if it's even possible, whether or not there's a record of it.
Right.
And those are the 2 plot lines with every myth that are sort of going on. If the folklorist was covering one and Adam and Jamie were covering the other, it'd be a lot cleaner.
Yeah.
But as it was in the last episode, we had all these different people popping in and we didn't know who they were. And it was like first episode, totally jarring. They had less of those other people because they had less room for them, I feel like, in this episode. And I thought it helped. Like every time she would pop in with a bit of folklore, I was like, oh, okay, that actually helps me understand something about this, as opposed to it just being like, what's happening? Who's talking to me?
Yeah.
Like you said, it was cleaner. That was so much better.
Yeah. And I also like that there was, it's still a little strange to me. I understand why they do it for the purposes of entertainment, but with almost all of these, they hold their cards pretty close to the vest
Yes.
when it comes to like, did this thing happen?
Right.
And the answer so far for each of them has been no, there's no evidence.
Yeah.
Like serious journalists have done their best to track this down. And
We'll get to the at the end of the Biscuit myth,
Yes.
a journalist who let us know that this didn't happen.
yeah, just straight up. And
really tries to make that point. I was like, whoa, Cronkite, hang on.
But I will say this, I like the way that it's edited because they slip that into basically right before it's tested, you know? So it's not, whereas last time we got that information after the fact and then it was like, and then it was weird because it was
deflating.
Like, right.
Yeah.
Like I just watched them make a rocket car, man.
Right.
And then Highway Patrolman was like, yeah, there's no evidence of a rocket car. And I was like,
Yeah.
All right, well.
We did get almost
See some
immediately
evidence.
in this episode, we went to yet another shopping montage. Those are back, but I loved this one. They
I
go
did
to
too.
the aviation place, Interface Aviation. They said it's 3.5 acres of surplus aviation stuff. I loved this. This is the kind of like weird Mythbusters world building stuff that I remember of just like, it's like seeing Adam's Cave or the parts of M5, where it's just like, oh my God, you would never see this. I can't believe these places exist.
Yeah.
These guys look so at home there. This place was awesome.
Places that they go back to too.
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost like those places become characters in and of themselves.
Totally.
And then it's funny because later in the show, they'll like look at each other and be like, are we going to, Bob's?
Right.
I was like, we're going to Bob's.
And I love too. I thought that this montage was better than the week before because it actually illustrated story beats. They actually went through, okay, here are the different types of airplane toilets. Here's why this one would
They had
not
every
work.
one in existence,
They had every
which I
one.
loved. That's a great fun fact.
And like here, the first one that they look at, it won't work because it only holds suction at altitude. So that would never work because in the myth, we specifically know that the plane had landed. Again, that's one of those story beats that they take you through
Yes.
as opposed to just coming back and telling you later, well, no, the toilet wouldn't have worked anyway. Doesn't matter, And so the montage meant something. It wasn't just we're shopping for a car and it's funny that we're shopping for a car.
Right.
It was them learning something about the engineering and the science and the mechanics of what they were doing, and it pulled you through it, and it felt so much better.
Yeah, totally agree. It was I mean, again, I hate to keep using the same phrase, but it was just a cleaner experience.
Yeah.
And it was far more reminiscent of the way that I remember the show.
We also got a great moment of character development from Adam in this episode where they look at the staircase for 747. Did you remember this part? They're showing like all the different cool surplus stuff that is in this massive warehouse. And then they get to this staircase and Adam's reaction was priceless.
I like this. This must be the stairway from a...
Stairway 747?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's the stairway. All right.
He likes the stairway way too much.
Oh, my. I would recognize that stairway anywhere.
I'd climb that if you let me.
I have.
Which is funny considering they cut from that almost immediately to a montage of making a butt.
Well, and the great part about that to me was that, and I wrote it down, is that just immediately, they're like, okay, we need to make a fake butt. And Adam's like, I got a guy. I mean, just zero hesitation. Like
Yes.
he knows where and how to get a fake butt on the fly.
Well,
that's an incredible skill.
What got me about that, though, is he starts saying, oh, yeah, I know the material I want to use is this hot melt vinyl. It's used in sex toys. And then they cut to him walking down the street in San Francisco. And my thinking was, oh, he's going into a sex shop.
Same.
Because that's what he just said. And that happens. I remember a later episode where they have to get like bondage gear or something. And they end up in this kink store in San Francisco. So I saw him walking down and then they hard cut to monster masks. So my note was, what I actually wrote down in my notes was sex toy shop ? Nope. Monsters.
That's right. That's right. You would be shocked at how related the two apparently are. But.
Yes. Yeah. It we get a classic moment in the monster mask shop though that was used over and over again in montages and openings of the show forever. Again, another one of those moments of like, it doesn't necessarily move the story forward, but it introduces us to our characters.
Right.
You'd like to try the butt head?
I would like to try the butt head.
The classic butthead mask.
Same.
The Adam butthead.
The Adam butthead. I mean, it's become a meme now, you know?
Oh, yeah.
Just that single image grab. But one of my favorite parts about that is that that's like the first conversation that takes place.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
they don't even go into why they're there.
Yeah.
He's just like, I want to wear that.
And also, he's just said, oh, this is commonly used to make sex toys. He shows up with the camera crew and is like, I'll take 10 gallons, please.
Don't worry about why.
Don't worry about why. Don't even ask. It's fine.
We don't need to get into the why of it all.
We talked about last week that we did technically introduce Carrie Byron in the last episode. We saw her for the first time, but she was mostly in the background or montages. This is Carrie's first real appearance, like actually named appearance on the show. They reference her.
No speaking lines.
What an introduction.
I know.
To the show.
I know.
I was a little bit uncomfortable, to be honest, that like
Same.
we've met one woman so far in the show. And as soon as they're like, we need to scan a butt, call Carrie.
Call Carrie.
It is redeemed somewhat by the fact that like, as this show goes on, and I think we're getting to pretty soon the Goldfinger episode where Adam is just completely debased and embarrassed of what he had to do. That it is a part of the show that like everybody ends up being embarrassed for this show.
Putting their bodies on the line in
Yes.
some way, shape, or form.
Yes, it wasn't just inflicted on Carrie, but it's the first time.
It's the fact that it's the introduction.
Yes.
To
we don't know
Carrie
who she
that-
is.
No.
And her introduction
Doesn't say anything.
is in a skin tight, flesh colored morph suit.
Bending over.
Bending
yes.
over. Welcome to Mythbusters, Carrie.
I mean, it is I do quite enjoy that. Then when she goes over to the computer to see it,
Yeah.
she like bites her lip.
Yeah. Yes. Like, yeah, she does. She has a moment of like, oh.
Yeah, so that's what it was. So that's what everyone's talking about. Oh.
It does feel like one of those things that people talk about, like, I don't know, you know, when they were younger and they posed for Playboy or something. And like, there's going to come a time in your life where you're going to be glad to have this record of what your like youth looked like, you know? And now Carrie has it in a 3D model.
In a 3D model of her butt. So, I mean, you know.
Carrie, it was so interesting to see her in this episode and some of the interactions, and it completely makes sense given what they were asking her to do and her role at the time. But when I think of Carrie Byron, I think of her in the later years as a fully fledged Mythbuster,
100%.
being very, very quick, very fast, very comfortable in front of the camera, very, excellent scientific communicator, constantly, doing these amazing things and like this model making work that she would do on the show and all these things. I just kept thinking she looks so young in this episode. She looks like a kid because she's clearly like getting used to being on camera and all this is new and it's clearly embarrassing what they're asking her to do. Yeah. It felt like a different person. Like it was really interesting to see that given, I mean, she's still out there today doing some amazing work, doing TV shows, doing all sorts of stuff. She's, one of the best. And it's cool to see where she started,
Yeah. Even if it is with a butt.
Even if it is with a butt.
It starts with a butt.
It starts with a butt. So many things in life. Who are we? Who are we to judge?
Look, I'm glad we can finally agree on something.
I did think the next note that I had was that when they start going into this actual myth, they need to make a strain gauge to see the weight on the toilet and all that.
Yep.
And the blueprint drawing of the strain gauge and the way they got into it, so great. Like explained what they were after and how it was going to work so much better than what we saw last week on the last episode.
Yeah.
I mean, even though they're ultimately they're drawing pictures of how they're going to suspend a butt over a toilet, it was very good visual storytelling. Like it actually started to lay out the story in a way that made sense and made you feel like that's one of the great things about Mythbusters. We go back to like that magic, right? They found ways to talk about complicated things and you felt like you were right there with them and you understood it.
It's like Oppenheimer where it's like, I feel smart. I get this.
Yes.
Like,
I could build an A-bomb.
Yeah, absolutely. Why not? I understand how the things go and they split or something. I don't know.
And that was such a... That's a really hard thing to do, and the show did it well. This was like an early glimpse of that to me, of just seeing the way that they would explain these things, and they do that throughout this episode. We'll get to later the water pressure gauge or the inches of water gauge that they make, and this kind of stuff where it's like, oh man, I remember being a kid and watching this and like understanding science in a way because of what they were doing. And this felt like the beginning of that. It was the first time we've really seen that on the show. Yeah. And I just loved it. I thought that was so cool.
That's always been like the great balance is that, it is thoroughly entertaining to watch, but you do learn something. Yeah. I mean, even in this episode, there were things that I was like, no way. I was like, kind of way. Yeah. It's like, okay. Yeah, sure. Science is weird, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah. They get into that with this myth with a lot of the stuff they're talking about, the pressures and how things would or wouldn't seal and the PSI gauges and all that kind of stuff. You know, like you said, even at a passing glance with the idea of this myth was like, yeah, no, this probably isn't going to happen. But when they started to actually do the tests and you saw the gauges and you actually saw the amount of pressure that was being created, it was surprising. Like it was actually like, oh, wow. Like, okay, there is some real science behind this. Yeah. If you'll pardon the behind pun. You won't pardon it?
We'll see. But I think we can beat it in a trial.
But, yeah, it just like it really felt like we were in there in the methodology, in the process throughout this episode in a way that made a very rewarding television show to watch.
Agreed.
It just made it a better show, even taking out the like, you know, the thing that the weird hindsight that we now have watching this show. I felt like I was much more entertained and a part of this episode of TV.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do have to point out that this is we're gonna complete a hat trick in this episode of Adam puts his mouth on everything. and furthermore, sometimes doesn't need to.
Often doesn't need to.
That's the part. I mean, like there's a part of me that deeply respects it. You know, he's like, I'm going to get hands on and in there. But like Jamie provides a perfectly good alternative in this one. And I was like, no, I'm going to blow on it. And it's like, all right, well.
Adam's like a baby, like they experience the world with their mouths, you know? And it's like, this is the only way I can know. I have more nerve endings. That's how I figure it out.
Look, when you get results like they get,
hard to argue.
I don't need to understand the method, you know, like that.
You mentioned this before, but this is the first time we saw it where they really went through a number of tests and changing variables on the toilet. So they test it first the way you would expect with a toilet seat, a shroud, everything else. Nothing really happens. There's just too much space. There's too much, you know, there's no way to make a seal. This whole myth is based on, does flesh make a seal? Right. Basically, is that gonna work? Is that gonna happen? And they try it multiple times and end up with no shroud on the toilet, no anything, actually starts to get a seal, but still doesn't completely work. Yeah. So you felt like you saw all the different ways that this could happen and you could walk through it. And, you know, by the time it got to that result, I felt like, clearly they've exhausted this.
They covered the full gamut of possibilities.
Exactly.
You know, like they tested for as many variables as were reasonable. Yeah. And were able to draw a perfectly reasonable conclusion based on that.
Speaking of that conclusion, did you catch it?
Whether or not it's true?
No. Did you catch that we got our first myth busted?
I did. That they specifically said the phrase.
And it's not busted. Adam or Jamie.
It's the narrator.
It's the narrator. I actually grabbed that clip because I feel like it's a big moment in the history of the show. Yep. It's the first time that we hear this.
Hit it.
Myth busted.
Here we are. We're home.
We are home, except that when you played that, I knew it wasn't coming, and still my brain expected the whooshing, like the
metal sign and all that.
Yes.
Yeah. It's crazy. It really makes me think even more about what we talked about last week, which was when was that decision made? Yeah. You know, when they were actually shooting the experiments, did they know that they were going with that framework or not? Yeah. Or, you know, was that something that they came up with in post or they came up with once the show was picked up? Like, when did that actually come in? Because the show is changing even now from episode 1 to episode 2. Yeah. It's changing pretty significantly week to week as they kind of figure this out. I happen to see a clip from the next episode, and we'll talk about that at the end of this week. But even more elements are starting to come in that you recognize. So it's crazy how fast it's changing here at the very beginning. And I did not expect that we would get no busted conversation in episode 1, and I actually have it in episode 2.
And again, I think the reason why that's so surprising to me is that this is still technically the pilot.
Yeah,
you
the
know?
second of 3 pilots.
So it's kind of thrilling to. It's like in a superhero movie, you get the origin out of the way in like 20 minutes. It's like, great.
Yeah.
But yes.
Or better yet, the opening credits.
Yes. Oh, thank you, Spider-Man 2. But we have to talk about sucking farts. I know. I can hear you already out there saying, no, Harrison, they added that in post. Like, there's no way. Because the final thing that they do is they actually have Adam sit on a toilet.
Yes.
And do like the most flushing that it can.
Yeah.
And it's so funny. I mean, like it's just like hysterical laughter the entire time.
It's the beginning of what would become a great Mythbuster tradition of Adam putting himself in the fray.
Yes.
You know, it would create, to your point about, you know, putting stuff in his mouth, that becomes, that's a thing you remember from the show, is Adam was willing to do anything, and he'd put himself right in the middle of it.
Yep.
If there was something that he could safely actually experience, he's going to do it.
No
and this
hesitation.
is the first glimpse, just sitting on that toilet, farting up a storm. And loving every minute of it.
Hey man, I was too.
Yeah.
You know, like I'm not above a fart joke. I'm just not. I'm not.
And it's the kind of thing, like, not to overanalyze a guy sitting on a toilet with fart sounds, but it is the kind of thing this show earns by being more scientific and by being smarter.
Yeah.
Throughout most of the episode, it makes this stuff funnier. It makes the wacky, you earn the wacky moments. It makes the wacky moments funnier. It makes you, it invests you into the people who are doing this stuff, which then invests you in the stories. There's a real point to it aside from just being hilarious television.
There's, and I hate this word because of what it's become, but there's genuine quirkiness.
Yeah.
You know,
totally.
Like there are just things that Jamie and Adam do that I'm like, that's not what the vast majority of us would do, but I'm so glad that that's how you do this.
Yeah.
Because this is so entertaining.
Well, they even brought that into the episode with some of the cutaways, like between scenes, where they'll just cut to a weird sculpture or mask or something in M5. And it's more, I noticed that even more of that in this episode, where they start to bring in these weird, they're just creating a world. Mm-hmm. They're just creating this weird, strange world where anything seems like it could happen and you're sort of living in it. It's that, you know, the Imaginarium of M5.
Yes.
You know, and it extends to the places that they go, the aviation place, the monster mask place, you know, all that stuff. Like, they are creating that wacky, strange, wonderful world that is such a nice part of the show. Yeah. It's you know, bigger than the myths. It's the thing that continues on, that episode to episode, that builds in its own way, and it's great.
Yes, and getting to watch them build it in real time is I mean, it's just cool.
It's a thrill.
I would highly suggest people go back and watch these few episodes, especially because it's just it's remarkable how quickly they get there.
You know, it's funny you say that. That's something after, like I said, my girlfriend Megan watched this episode with me, and she had not watched episode 1 with me. So she watched this and had the same reaction we did last week. Yeah, this is bizarre. Yeah. Like, whoa, this is so different than the show. I remember all that stuff that we talked about. But the thing that she and I got to talk about afterwards was just, I feel like, and maybe I'm wrong, but I don't feel like you get to see this on television anymore, which is a show finding itself to this degree. Yes. Shows today, because of the dynamics of television and the logistics and the finances and everything else,
fully formed.
They come out fully formed. They
Venus
have to be.
Out of Zeus.
If they're not, they don't make it.
Yeah.
You know, it comes out. If it's not perfect, it's done.
Yeah.
And if they made Mythbusters from fresh today, Adam and Jamie would be the behind the scenes guys. They would not be the hosts.
Yeah.
The show would be far more polished.
Yeah.
Like, if you saw something like this, it would have been the original pilot that nobody ever sees and never aired on television, and they completely remade it and they glitzed it up and they glammed it up and all that. You wouldn't see the mistakes and some of the weirdness. And obviously part of that is we're looking back 20 years later, you know, technology's different, shows look different, but still on a fundamental level, it still feels like you are seeing something be created. And you don't get to do that anymore.
No.
So I really do think it's fun if folks are listening to this and they haven't started rewatching. If you love Mythbusters, what a cool opportunity to see a show like that
Join us.
really come to life, because you don't see that very often. You know, you go back to the, like, whatever your favorite show is, you go back to the pilot of Breaking Bad, right? They didn't have the budget maybe that they would end up with. Maybe they hadn't, you know, figured out their production quite as much, but it still looks like Breaking Bad.
Yeah.
You know, it's still like a really highly produced professional television show.
Right.
This feels more like a bunch of people figuring it out. This is more like what you would see on YouTube.
Yes.
You know,
that's a great point.
And to see that evolve, as I imagine we will, it's what I'm looking forward to over the course of the show, into a fully fledged classic, you know, Emmy nominated television show.
Yes.
I can't think of another place you get to do that. You get to just watch that in real time.
Except on YouTube. That's an interesting point. It's almost like YouTube has become the inheritor of that trait, that quality. And I mean, some of that is that a YouTube channel can go on for as long as the creator chooses.
Well, it feels like there used to be a thing that you heard a lot more that just doesn't exist anymore, which is, you know, somebody mentions a show. I don't even have a good one that's coming to mind right now, but somebody mentions a show and you're like, oh, I heard about that. Should I watch it? And someone would be like,
skip seasons 1 and 2.
Skip seasons 1 and 2. And then it gets, you don't hear that anymore, because if season 1 and 2 isn't perfect,
it's gone.
It's gone.
Yeah.
You never see it again.
Yeah.
And like the shame with that is the thing that makes television so different from film, for example, is with a film, you know, maybe it's developed over the course of a couple of years. It's shot over the course of 6 to 8 months, and then that's it, and it lives on forever. A television show is made week in and week out for years.
Yeah.
The writers follow the cues of the actors, and the actors are following the writers, and there's a back and forth, and there's a dynamic, and what works stays and gets pushed and evolved. What doesn't work gets changed. It's a continually evolving piece of art in a way that a film kind of isn't, because of the timeline. Just you don't get to do that to the same extent, because
unless you're George Lucas.
Yeah, unless you're George Lucas, and then you go back, you know, every 10 years.
Yep.
But you know, that's one of the things about television. It's more like live theater in that respect, where it's performance after performance, week in, week out, people learning each other and having a more symbiotic relationship in how they make it.
Yeah.
And
tightening and improving.
Exactly. And we're kind of losing that in TV because of the dynamics and the confines that are put on television production now. You don't get this.
Yeah.
You don't get people making something together for 10 years and figuring it out to where by the end it's something that you could never otherwise make.
Yeah. Well, it's not, I mean, I get it. I get why it's not a safe investment. Right. You know, like if we want to go back to True Detective, one thing about season 4 is that it was not True Detective.
Right.
And in order to be made, they were like shoehorn in True Detective.
Right.
You know, so like there's an exceptional amount of risk aversion when it comes to trying something. And like you were saying, you've got one season to get it right. Yeah. And if it doesn't blow up, bye-bye. There are 20 series right on your tail that will gladly take that slot.
100%. Going back to this myth before we wrap it up, what was your thoughts on the overall result? They, as we said, they busted it pretty conclusively. To me, I didn't think that was crazy, but I did have a couple of like process thoughts, but I wanted to see what you were thinking first.
I thought it was clean. Yeah. I mean, it seemed like they tried everything within reason and even a few unreasonable things. Like at one point they adopted the assumption that the butt would cover the entire bottom of the bowl. Right. Just to try it. Yeah. You know, to give full benefit of the doubt. No, I thought this one, when they declared it busted, I was like, yeah, absolutely.
The only thought that I had, and to be clear, I don't think this would change the outcome. So maybe that's why it's not worth doing or not worth taking the time to do. We didn't really talk about how the butt was constructed, but it's essentially
a sentence.
It's essentially a flat mold that is straight legs that they are lowering onto the toilet with a winch system with weights on top of it. Right. That's not really how the body works.
Fair.
So my thought was, if you really want to talk about, because the question to me, and maybe I'm thinking about this wrong, but the question to me is about, does the weight of the person help create the seal? That's why it needs to be a big person, right? Does the weight and the way the weight is sitting on this toilet help create the seal?
Yeah.
When they showed in the early tests with the toilet seat and all that, there were a lot of gaps around the way that it was sitting on the toilet and this kind of stuff. And my thinking was maybe it wouldn't change anything.
Yeah.
I certainly have never looked at myself in a mirror while on the toilet, so I don't know.
Yeah.
I avoid that at all costs.
Got to.
But if you had made essentially a weighted suit, and instead of the legs being a contraption that was lowered on, it was something a person could wear and actually sit on the toilet with the legs. Because if you think about when you're sitting down, we don't think about this, but our legs have weight.
Yeah.
And so your legs sitting off the front of a toilet and hanging down are actually providing a different weight distribution that I think would affect, it's not just downward pressure, which is what they were doing with the stack of like, regular like weightlifting weights.
Yeah.
On top of it, it was just downward pressure. That's not really how your body distributes weight.
Right.
So that was my only question was if you had made a contraption, one, it would have been really funny.
Yeah.
Right.
Hilarious. Adam wearing Carrie's butt. That's an amazing sentence. First of all,
there's your pitch for the show right there.
That's the sequel.
But I just wonder if that would have changed anything. And I still don't think it would have changed enough to where it's like, oh, they're stuck, stuck permanently.
Right.
But I thought there was at least room to explore more of the way that the weight distribution affects how the seal is created and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I don't know. That was my only thought in watching it was, would that make any difference? I have no idea.
That's fair. That's fair. I think that weight distribution and it is the one other factor that could have been added to make it. But I still think in any case, there's just not enough suction.
Right.
Like that's the fundamental problem.
Right. And that was the thing that they busted out at the end was that you're talking about like holding things close to the vest. The last thing that they reveal is, well, it only creates suction for like 2 seconds.
Right.
So there's not a consistent vacuum, which is what you would need to do that. Even if you were to get stuck, the seal would immediately be broken and it wouldn't matter. So the myth definitely fully busted.
Boosted.
But yeah, just curious about other aspects of it.
I'm not sure what was proved here, but at least it's good television.
The next one was weird for me.
Really?
Yeah. I don't. Well, you want to go ahead and walk us through it?
Yeah, I'll tee it up for us. Yeah. Next myth 2, the Biscuit Bazooka, also called the Biscuit Bullet because damn it. Interesting thing about this myth, I'll just say at the beginning, this is one I remember. And when I say remember, not just from the show, I remember this story existing before the show.
Oh, interesting.
So this is, we talked about this a little bit last week, that pre-social media age and like how stories got shared. I remember this being one of those like chain emails that like inevitably your uncle, it's always an uncle, would pass along like, here's a weird, wacky story. And I remember this story. And if you haven't watched the episode, the confines of the myth are that a woman was sitting in her car on a really hot day and heard what sounded like a gunshot.
Having just gone to the grocery store.
Yes. She'd just gone to the grocery store. She's now sitting in her car. Maybe she's running errands. She hears what sounds like a gunshot and feels something hit her in the back of the head. She reaches back and feels what she thinks are brains leaking out of her skull. Turns out it's a tin of biscuits that had exploded and been propelled through the car, and it was biscuits that she was holding in the back of her head. I remember that story specifically, and I remember kind of weird train of thought this took me down, but I remember seeing like a trailer for the next episode of Mythbusters, and they were talking about this, and it hitting like, oh, I do know that story.
Yeah.
And so that memory kind of explained to me or gave me some context for something we talked about maybe even too much last week of this whole actual story thing. Like, oh, they're testing a purportedly real story.
Yeah.
I remember now, oh, right. Some of these stories in the pre-internet age, we did all know.
Yeah.
In a way that we don't now.
Yeah.
We don't, there's, social media and things going viral. There's so much that I don't think there's not as much of like a cultural awareness of specific events all the time.
Right.
But there was back then. And so it made me think about like, oh, this episode was better for me because being a kid, I knew the story. And so I was invested in, is that actually true?
Yes.
It was almost like Mythbusters was like the physical version of Snopes.
Yeah.
if you remember Snopes.
Oh, yeah.
So it was like that. As soon as I saw this myth come up, I was like, oh, right. That's the context of this, that this was in. Now that feels weird. And I think that's what we were bumping against so much last week. It's like, who's ever heard of a rocket car? What? This is a ridiculous story.
You can look this up.
And you could just look this up. But back then, that's kind of how this was. And that was a unique feature of Mythbusters was, here's this thing that you've heard. We're going to investigate it.
Yeah.
That makes a lot more sense to me now with this myth. But what were your thoughts? You said this one was weird for you.
Well, this one's weird for me just because I guess I kind of split my answer. I was like, okay, number one, is it possible for a can to heat up enough that it busts and, potentially send some kind of projectile biscuit? Sure. Yeah, why not? That sounds perfectly plausible to me. I mean, cars can get ridiculously hot.
Right.
But that's also one of the problems with this myth to me is that in order for it to get hot enough to do that, I don't think a person would just be sitting there in their car. That's historically a bit of a problem. People being in hot vehicles.
Yeah.
That and also what sort of, just game this out in your head. What sort of reasonable human being thinks their brains are falling out and continues to believe that for several minutes lucidly?
Yeah. Yeah.
If your brains are falling out of your head, I think at least one or two primary functions is going to be suffering significantly.
Yeah.
That's just what?
That's a good point. I do think that goes back to kind of the dueling storytelling or the dueling sort of, I don't know, plots, if you will, that the show is on at this point, which is, I think you're right. There is an interesting scientific question, if you want to call it that, of can the biscuits explode and can they be thrown far enough to hit somebody?
Yeah.
Then there is the actual human story element of it, which is not
the
really
facts of the story, the way the story is constructed itself,
which is not really testable,
right?
But they do. I did feel like they from the other perspective, they gave it the best shot. I actually really liked the methodology here, and it felt very Mythbusters-y.
Same.
But you're right that they're testing inherently ridiculous stories.
Right.
And that part of it is harder you can't explain human nature, right? You can't explain that away. You can't test that away. So it does feel a little bit weird.
It feels to me like in these early episodes, they are testing for the kernel of truth within something that is obviously a lie. Every single one of the stories that has been covered recently or in these two episodes, you can use basic logic to be like, yeah, probably not.
Yeah.
Doesn't make it any less fun.
Yeah.
Which is why I'm glad that they've glommed onto it is that it is still very amusing to pick it apart with such specificity and to really briefly take it seriously and do everything you can to be like, is there any plausibility here?
Right.
Whatsoever? Or can we just dismiss this out of hand?
I do want to hop in there mentioning that. I want to hop into the process on this one because I thought it was really great. I really enjoyed this. Everything from, we go back to a shopping montage yet again, but
got to.
It again makes more sense because they're talking about different types of biscuits. That was an interesting thing. They
Same.
actually mentioned, I wrote down, they mentioned having a control group, which is the first time we've gotten that kind of methodological breakdown.
That sort
on
of
the show.
scientific method.
Yeah, exactly. And it's obviously a very simplified version of that, but it was, we didn't really get any of that kind of comparative testing conversation and process in the first episode. So that was interesting to see. I absolutely love the biscuit rig that they make and put in the car.
Delightful.
It's so it is the early, and we really get there by the last myth. There's some stuff in the last myth that I was just like, it was just like hit after hit of like, oh my God, this is so Mythbusters. Oh, that's the first, oh my God. But even here, I started to think about, it felt like this was the first time where Adam and Jamie's skill sets really became obvious as special effects artists.
Yes.
Because anybody you could go out and find engineers who can build weird stuff. Their job was to make objects that visually communicated a story. It's visual storytelling.
Yeah.
That's what you have to do in film and commercials, and that's what made them so good for this show.
Yes.
The biscuit rack and the way it's like, the way it's labeled, the way it's shot on, and the way it plays on camera, it tells you the story of exactly here's what we're testing and how we're going to work. And it makes an image in your mind of if this works, we're going to see X. I didn't feel like we had any of that in the first episode. But here
we have it almost 3 times in a row.
Almost every myth has some element of that, of just you feel locked in and like it is playing out perfectly the way it is supposed to.
Yes.
And that is the skill set that those guys have that is so rare and awesome. And I felt like this was the first time we saw them playing into that really, really well.
Yeah. I also thought it was funny that they had to, again, blur out the obvious Pillsbury.
This time it made sense, though, because they couldn't put tape on the biscuit cans or else it might affect if it blew up.
That's a great point, because it was the can itself that was part of the test, not the thing inside of it.
Right,
Okay.
exactly.
That's
so
a
if
great
they
point.
had taped
That's a
up the
great
can,
point.
it might not have exploded.
Yeah. What did you think would happen?
I remembered this a little bit, and what I remembered and what I ultimately felt like happened was this myth illustrated one of the things that happened somewhat rarely on the show, but that made Mythbusters so satisfying, where it works perfectly.
Yes.
Like it works exactly the way, if you've heard this story and even if you go, oh, that's ridiculous, the basic the physics is really all they're testing, and the physics work. The can explodes. It explodes at temperatures that are completely reasonable for a car that's been sitting outside for a while.
Pretty low, in fact.
Pretty low, like less than, because Adam's car that they did this in, which I love, by the way, that they just grab Adam's car.
That just beautiful.
And there's all these jokes about, oh, your dashboard's melting and all this kind of stuff. And it was like, wow, years later they wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
But like, I think his car in the parking lot outside of M5 was at like 140 degrees, and they tested at 120 and it still worked. So it's like well within the confines of the myth.
Yep.
All of that makes perfect sense. And then the cans immediately start exploding
And firing.
And shooting the biscuits to the front of the car. It's so satisfying that it works the way you want it to.
Yeah.
And so I was kind of spoiled it for myself because I had that memory and I knew that that's what was going on, but it made it no less satisfying. It's wonderful to see. It's a ridiculous thing that actually works.
And it's a thing that you are thrilled to be wrong about.
Yes.
Because I didn't remember this one. And I guess I did think that the physics of the thing were possible, but that does not make it, like you were saying, any less satisfying.
Yeah.
I mean, it's such a, and part of what makes it even more so is that Adam and Jamie's excitement is just infectious.
Yes.
I mean, like they're so childlike in their giddiness that it just makes you, I shout during this show.
Yeah, same.
I go like, whoa. And, it's it elicits such a genuine reaction.
Yes. 100%.
And this one and the next one especially just had those moments where I was like, oh, yes.
Absolutely. And like, I take your point about, again, going back to the human element of this.
Yeah.
I don't find that side to be as ridiculous in the sense of here's how I imagine something like this could happen. You go to the grocery store, or you forget and leave a bag of groceries in the back of your car. I've done that many times.
Same.
Go in, do something else. I imagine that the car's been sitting out there. The person comes, gets back in their car. They're cutting the car on, and boom, it happens. And in that moment, they get hit with something and they reach back, and for a split second, it's like, holy crap, what is that? And that's the whole thing.
And they think that they've heard a gunshot. Well, see, now that you've said it like that, it's also, I mean, there have been plenty of studies that have shown that like people that are exposed to the sound of a gunshot when they're not expecting it does very strange things to the brain.
Oh, totally.
You immediately go into fight or flight mode.
Totally.
So I can see with the adrenaline pumping.
Yeah.
How you might, your brain, and also we're pattern seekers. So I could see how you would, and this is 2003. This isn't that long after Columbine. So there's a lot of elements
and 9/11
here. And 9/11.
Yeah, there's like an uncomfortableness with
and unease
those things in public.
And
also, even if you only think it's brains for a fraction of a second, when you tell that story to someone, that becomes the story.
That great point.
You know what I mean?
Great
it's
point.
not that you have to maintain that thought for very long. It's if it happens and then you tell your friend,
That's the centerpiece.
I heard what I thought was a gunshot. And I reached back and there was something sticky on my head. And I'm like, oh my God, is that my brains? What's going on? Now that becomes the story.
Yeah.
And it evolves over time. It gets simplified. It gets broken down. To me, I can see, and we'll talk about apparently, as this reporter let us know, this did not happen.
Yeah.
But
There's no evidence.
it's not as crazy to me as Pop Rocks and Soda was, as some of the other stuff that we've seen so far, that a human being could think this and that this could become a story in that way.
I think I'll give that to you. I think I'm fairly convinced now that we've gone through it that it's because I mean also again anytime that you hear or experience something that you're not expecting,
Yeah.
your mind tends to go to worst case scenario.
Can I tell you what I wasn't expecting?
Please.
The sound effect when the biscuits blew up. I think we need that one more time.
Yep. That's not.
There's no way that's the real sound.
It can't be.
That had to have been
It
souped
can't
up
be.
in post.
It's too. I mean, I would love if that was the case. It's like the sucking farts. You know, I'll give it to them because I want it so badly.
I want it to be real.
But like that is the most Nickelodeon ass.
Yes,
Like,
yes, that is. You just got slime.
Yeah.
I feel like we just need to keep that on our soundboard from now on.
Great point.
So that we're just like going through an episode and like randomly. That's our censor bleep from here on out,
Yep.
or that punctuates.
What a sound engineer.
I know.
Let's hand it to that. You know what?
Give it up.
Hit. I'll shut up. Let's get it clean.
Full point to the
That's-
poor Australian sound designer.
That's a silly noise right there.
That is a good silly noise. That's one of those. What's the meme of like someone who understood their job perfectly? You know, it's that
Yes.
thing of like you knew.
You understood the assignment.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
That's it. You understood the assignment perfectly. The other clip I had to pull from this section, and I don't know if this stood out to you or if I'm just a 12-year-old.
Okay.
But throughout this whole section, they were interviewing a food scientist, and that was sort of their documentary part of it. And actually, I'll give them credit. It's much like in the Pop Rocks and Soda myth last week where they had the doctor. I thought this guy really did add because he talks about the science of the pressure that built up in the can. Years later, Adam and Jamie would do that themselves. That would be like the warning science content portion of the show, which I love, and I can't wait till we get there. But at this point, it was actually nice to hear from that expert.
Agreed.
But then once they've gone through the myth and they've seen that, oh, this actually, maybe this is a little bit plausible. Adam says plausible, by the way. There's no sign.
Yeah.
But we do get an early, Adam says, oh, this plausibly could happen.
Yeah.
I thought that was interesting.
Me too.
But as they're talking about all this, they cut back to the food scientist who is trying to explain to people, I would not worry about this. I would not worry about this actually happening. You're at no risk of anything like this really going on. But the phrasing that he chooses to use.
I may have a premature bursting of my container.
Why did he say I may have of my container? That's what I don't understand. It's one thing to go, you may experience a premature bursting of the container. But
No, it's very personalized.
he very much personalizes
He
it,
takes ownership of that premature bust.
taking you on a journey, I would say.
I don't even, that is just a delightfully, that's something that I feel like the internet has forced our brains into not making any phrases like that can be taken out of context.
That's a good point. This is pre-meme culture.
Yes,
So this is before
right.
anything that you said. Although I do feel like when that was edited into the show, they fully understood what they were doing.
They knew.
They had to.
Yeah. I'm just saying, I don't think he at the time was putting together like, you guys. Oh, that's not how. Oh, come on.
That's not what I meant, you guys.
That's not what oh man, that's phenomenal.
The last clip I wanted to play in this section is what we've mentioned this several times, is at the very end, and this goes back a little bit to the Jado car myth last week.
Yep.
We see this work in the Biscuit Bazooka myth here work pretty much to a T. I mean, the can explodes. It explodes in, I think it was 58 minutes is the first one.
Yeah.
Not a ridiculous amount of time.
In a direct, I mean, it is like a bazooka.
Yeah.
It goes, woo.
One of the cans that explodes, I think they said the biscuits land in the front seat, which means they would have gone past the headrest to do it. Like, it's perfect.
Yep.
But then they reveal that there is no recorded incident of this happening.
Yep.
Which is, again, a little, it's just that tension that's in the show between what you've seen and the methodological approach, and then the actual, in the real world, did this happen sort of investigation that are kind of competing throughout the show. And then I think it sometimes makes the results feel slightly unsatisfying when you've just gotten the catharsis of, oh my God, it works. And then you hear, yeah, but it never happened.
Yeah.
It's a little bit odd,
Yeah.
but they're figuring that out. But they go to a reporter who lets us know in no uncertain terms, this did not happen.
I tried to track it down. I tried to find the friend of the friend. I couldn't do it. I tried to find the location where it actually happened. I couldn't. I looked for police reports. There were none. And the truth is, this didn't happen.
Police reports?
That caught me as well.
What? I mean, you and I just had this whole discussion about if this really happened, like, what would it be?
Yeah.
It would not. The second after you think your brains have fallen out and you pull your hand back and there's biscuit dough on it, there's no police report getting filed. You're not calling 911. This isn't ending up in the papers because someone. What would be the story? They thought this happened and it didn't? That's not a news story. That's a viral story.
Exactly. That's a story you tell your buddies after a couple beers.
Yeah.
That's not a...
Exactly. Like, it was so weird that they go into this like hardcore, like as like the true crime journalist on the case. I'm gonna hunt this down. I'm gonna find the friend of the friend. I'm gonna find the police. I don't feel like it's that kind of story.
No.
I didn't think that was that convincing to, I really feel like this could potentially have happened.
There could be a kernel of truth here.
Yeah.
Like whether or not there is hard documentation of it happening,
right.
We've all but proven that it can happen.
Yeah.
So that's kind of enough for me. I mean, again, the most questionable parts of this are not even, like, I find it far more questionable that you would, if I feel something wet on my body, I check it.
Yeah, you think it's blood. That's often the first thought.
And then, you check it wherever it is, and then you bring it to your eyesight to confirm, is it red?
Right. And to go back to what I said before, if you're telling someone that story, you would go, I was wondering if I was bleeding.
You milk it. Yeah, absolutely.
You talk about what your thought process was.
Good storytelling.
Yeah.
Like that's...
So I think this is actually, even though, Adam says it, but they don't go into detail, I think this is actually a good use of the plausible determination.
Very much so.
Because you can't confirm that it really did happen, but it's entirely possible that it actually took place at some point. There's nothing in the physics that, says it couldn't happen.
Right.
And despite, I think the conversation we've had here about the human nature of it, it's actually a little bit deeper than what they did on the show.
Yeah.
And I get that. It's a television show. They only have so much time, but it's also, I just, the whole reporter thing did not convince me at all that this didn't actually happen, because it doesn't seem like the kind of thing that you would have hard evidence for. I just think it's one of those things. It's one of those stories, like you said.
Even and that's the I think the news stories were like looking for news. You don't call a reporter for that.
No.
Give me the New York Times. You're not going to believe what just happened.
You're not going to believe what didn't just happen.
It involved a biscuit. I'll see you in a few hours. Please bring Michael Barbaro.
Myth 3, the leaping lawyer.
Yeah.
So this is the one we talked about last week that I had absolutely no memory of going into this episode, did not recall whatsoever. But briefly to talk about the confines of this myth, a lawyer on the 24th floor of a skyscraper was apparently showing off by bouncing off of the windows of the skyscraper. I wrote here in my notes, WTF.
Yeah.
He repeatedly bounced.
So he's insane.
Yes.
Okay.
He repeatedly bounced off a plate glass window until it suddenly broke and he fell to his death. And the first note I wrote down was, what's the myth?
Yeah.
What? And then my next note was, can you break a window? That's the myth.
On that story?
Yeah.
I don't think so. I said hard no across the board.
I was really confused as to what the myth was.
Even happened.
Yeah, like what are we actually, and then Jamie kind of immediately clarified it, which was we're trying to see if a window like that could break, which again, at the beginning of this, and it's about to turn around, but at the beginning of this, I was like, yeah, no. Can you break a window? That doesn't seem crazy to me.
Yeah.
Like they even,
really?
No, well, it didn't seem crazy to me for the reasons that they talk about, which is you don't know what's wrong with that window.
Yeah. Like, I guess where my thought immediately went is that I was more interested in the specific height of the building given, and just the fact that, like, I don't know a lot about glass, but I'm pretty sure that's some of the strongest glass. So the idea of a person, quote unquote, horsing around, being able to generate enough force to bust through that thing. On the face of it, you're right. They get into some great stuff about all the caveats and what could be wrong.
And that's
with
what
that
saved
window.
it for me.
100%. Because on the face of it, I don't think so. I'm fairly certain that skyscrapers are pretty distinctly designed not to do that. And we've had skyscrapers that are pretty tall for a long time. The technology is only getting better, you know. Like,
well, I guess what I'm saying is, I just felt as a question for
a
television show,
the
notion of can you break a window was not as interesting to me immediately as can Pop Rocks and soda blow up your stomach?
Right.
Will biscuits explode and syndicate? It was a thing of windows break all the time.
Yeah.
And anything could have done it. You know, we don't like. Yeah, maybe it did break. Maybe it did. Like it just didn't seem that interesting to me. They immediately turned me around by diving into this methodology and talking about the pressure that is created at those in the atmosphere at those heights, and the various factors of the glass. What makes that kind of glass different? It was one of those times where I really feel like I imagine there being a story meeting where this myth came up and everybody going, "Can you break a window? That's our whole myth."
Yeah,
and then them realizing, what's interesting about this isn't the question, it's the process.
Yes.
That's what makes this fascinating. And within 30 seconds of me going, this is the stupidest myth I've seen so far, it completely turned me around and I loved this myth.
I did too. And it's almost like this was the moment that it was fully like, now this is what the show will be.
Yes.
Is really not getting that involved in the specifics of the case itself, as far as like, did it happen? Did it not happen? But focusing on everything else around it to say, like, is there any there?
And creating a beat by beat narrative exploration
of their thought processes. Which are fascinating to watch.
Of how and why this would need to work. You said earlier, giving it the best shot. What does that actually mean?
Yeah.
What does that look like?
Yeah.
The storytelling here, and this is to come back to what I said before about where you see Adam and Jamie just strut their stuff, is this myth.
Yes.
This is the first place that we get the frame by frame gauge.
Yes.
The frame by frame speed gauge that they make on the wall.
Yeah.
Later that that's like used in the design.
It's iconic.
Iconography of the show. That becomes such a huge thing. We get the first, it's not really high speed camera, so to speak. It's frame by frame.
I noticed that.
But it's kind of like high speed camera, which becomes such a big part of the show.
And I will be very interested to see if a high-speed camera is introduced as soon as we're out of the pilots.
Yes.
Because I have to imagine that with both the Biscuits and most especially with this one,
they were like, we need this.
Oh man, watching it in slow-mo is just... That's about to become an entire genre on television. It's just watching things explode and slow-mo.
And to what we said earlier, it's one of the most successful YouTube channels of all time. The slow-mo guys.
Yeah.
Who openly say they took their inspiration from Mythbusters. That's what got them into it.
Here we are.
So it really is full circle in that respect. But when they started getting into the methodology on this one, this was like, it was like a great episode of Cosmos or Bill Nye, or, it just immediately, you're like, here's a thing I did not think I would be interested in. I didn't think I would care about.
I didn't think there was that much science involved.
But it's so much more complicated than I ever imagined, and I'm just here for it. And it's awesome. And all I want to see is that glass break.
Yes.
Why would I care about can you break a window? They made me care about the question of can you break a window? That is Mythbusters at its best.
And so much of it is just down to the fact that you get to watch them react and think about things in real time.
Yes.
They're fascinating individuals. And the way that their brains work and react to things, and especially play off of one another.
100%.
I mean, it's a perfect pairing.
Yeah.
You know, it's peanut butter and chocolate. Like it's just like a super fascinating. And we talked a little bit the last time about how there have been people that are like, oh, you know, that they actually hate each other. Right. Like, dude, be that as it may, they are two of a kind.
Yes.
I mean, they really, it's a tandem body.
It's an iron sharpens iron sort of situation with those two.
Yes.
You brought up earlier the water gauge, you know, when Adam decides to use his mouth to pull the water through the tube for some reason. But I love that.
Does it again.
I love that whole sequence of they're using a gauge, it's not sensitive enough. And Jamie seemingly off the cuff is like, what if we just made it out of water? Inches of water is going to be more accurate. It's going to be this, blah, 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 blah. They mock it up. They try it. It works. And then you see them implement it. And it's like,
it's great.
It's so what you love about this show.
Yeah.
And it's just like, oh my God. And it makes you, again, going back to what we said even early on, it makes you feel like you understand it. It kind of makes you feel like you could do it.
Yeah.
Which is so rare and cool.
It doesn't. Because another thing that I love about it is that it does, like you were saying earlier, it highlights their particular set of skills.
Yes.
That allow them to be able not only to do it, but to show it in a fascinating way.
Yes.
And that's where it comes into play with watching their brains work, is that they come from a position of, how do I represent this visually?
Yep.
Can I represent this visually? And seeing them apply that with a scientific angle, I mean, it's just great.
It's another place too where the interviews actually, I thought, lent a lot to this. They had a structural engineer who starts talking about, no, this is why this shouldn't work. This is why glass is this way. And then at a certain point, he turns and says exactly what I was thinking from the beginning, which is
glass is weird.
But glass is weird. It's a man-made object, you know, like who knows? He did use my favorite term I've ever heard, which is stress razors. Said that there could be stress razors in the glass, which I just think when I'm in my 40s, that's going to be the name of my emo band. But I love it.
Razors are R-A-Z-O-R-S.
We are the stress razors.
Yes,
hello, Garner. If you're from North Carolina, that's a funny joke. If you're not, you don't care.
Yep.
But it's just fantastic. And then we start seeing the test. They build, again, this is sort of like a years later, or maybe even not that long later, this would have been Buster. This would have been a perfect situation to have Buster.
I thought that.
But they don't have him yet. So they build this cool contraption that's holding sandbags. And this is actually where they started talking about the distribution of the weight on this analog. This actually is what made me go back and think about the airplane toilet, because they start talking about the way weight is carried on the body is not just a single weight, right? It's actually distributed differently in different parts. And, you know, we don't think about it, but every part of your body has weight associated. Your arm is actually really heavy. And that if your arm is up or down, that could change the weight distribution. So they build this really interesting like slide mechanism, slingshot powered by these huge rubber bands to launch these sandbags, this analog, into the glass. They pull suction on the glass to actually get the correct PSI, the negative pressure that you would have at that height. I mean, like, the whole test is so satisfying and cool.
Yes.
And the bags start bouncing off, and it's not working, and it's not working, and it's not working.
Until they account for the weight distribution.
Until they account for it. And I thought this is a place, you were talking earlier about holding the cards to the vest. The editing was great here because you keep seeing it bounce off, and you're like, oh, this isn't going to work. Well, that sucks. Like, I wanted to see glass break. And then the structural engineer is like, but anything can happen. Glass is weird. This could, you change one variable, it all goes up. They shift the bags. The next test hits the glass, and that glass shatters. And this to me was more satisfying than the rocket car.
Same.
purely based on storytelling.
Yeah.
It was significantly less, extravagant and amazing than the idea of a rocket powered car. This is something small, something they did in an afternoon in the shop.
Yeah.
And I thought the storytelling made it better.
The storytelling, and I think the science of like the changing of things, and the fact that, because I wrote it down because it surprised me so much, when it shatters, they're firing it from 3 yards.
Yeah, which is nothing.
And at a speed of 5.6 miles per hour.
160-pound guy, I think, was what they accounted for, which is average,
doable
across the board, doable.
And they didn't even because the glass guy was talking about like how chips can make such a. So I was like, oh, they're probably going to chip the glass. They didn't need to.
Didn't need to.
You're so right, because I knew how the rocket car was going to play out.
Right.
It was cool to watch.
Right.
I thought I knew how this was going to play out, and not only was I proven wrong, it was decisively wrong.
Yes.
And it was with perfectly reasonable variables.
Absolutely.
Things that can absolutely happen. And at a low enough setting that I was like, oh, wow. That. All right.
And it goes back to, last week we talked so much about with Rocket Car. When I listened to that episode back, even I was thinking like, man, maybe we went too hard on this is the first myth. Like, were we fair? This is why we feel that way.
Exactly.
Because this is what Mythbusters could do. This is what the show...
And what it will go on to do.
And what it will go on to do. Yeah. And what it did one episode later, which is also amazing as to how good they got so quickly.
Well, that's what's so funny about you talking about your girlfriend watching it.
Yeah.
And how she was like, this is so different. I was like, they have come miles
in for us a week,
right?
Which is amazing.
Yeah.
And like, I would love to. Hopefully, one day we'll get to talk to somebody from the show and learn how these
Fingers
pilots were
crossed.
shot.
Yeah,
because I would love to know how. I'd love to know what this process was like from the inside. Because I am certain that we are not just noticing something that isn't there. This was totally intentional that they were evolving this storytelling over the course of the show. But yeah, that is exactly why we feel that way. It's because this is, we spoke about it last week. Sometimes people make the mistake of saying, oh, Mythbusters, that show where they blew everything up. That was just to get you in the door.
Yeah, exactly.
This is what kept you
incidental.
There. This is what kept you there. This is what made it such a great and classic show, is stuff like this, that they could take something that me, as a fan of the show, the host of the friggin' podcast about the show, they introduce the idea and I go, well, this is stupid.
Yeah.
And 10 minutes later, I'm going, this is the best TV show in the world.
That's been the most thrilling thing about rewatching it, is that I feel like most people have a generally fond memory, but to see it hold up, and to see it actually like, I appreciate it more now.
Yeah.
Because I mean, some of that is just age,
Right.
I actually understand some of the science that they're getting at, but I mean, that you don't have many other things like that.
No.
That just are more satisfying the further away you get from it.
Yeah.
Because of how unique it was. That's great. This is just a great show. I went from, I really liked that show. I recall enjoying it too. No, this is one of the better shows that's been on television, I think.
Totally.
It's I get it.
So let's talk about the result of this one, because I have some information that I want to get into. I'll give people a peek behind the curtain.
Oh boy.
I texted Harrison this week and said, don't do any research.
Yeah, no problem.
Because I want to hit you with something as we talk about it. They do talk about on the episode, not only is this entirely possible, they say this really happened. And they go into at the end of the episode and the actual event that this whole thing is based on, which is different than what we've experienced so far, where it's basically been, no, this didn't happen. We can't find the story, blah, blah, blah.
Every time. In
this case, they actually do have the information they presented. So I did some research, looked a little bit deeper into it. And it is true. This absolutely did happen. It was a Toronto-based lawyer named Gary Hoy, who sadly plunged to his death from the 24th floor of the Toronto Dominion Bank Tower. And apparently we were talking about, like, why was this guy doing this? He was demonstrating to students that the windows were unbreakable.
Oh my.
Which is a bit like calling it the unsinkable Titanic.
Yeah.
It just creates a bad opportunity. And apparently he had done this before. he had done this multiple times, and this one time he was doing it and it broke and he unfortunately died.
Yeah.
And there's a whole bunch of stories out there about it. But here's the thing. The window didn't break.
Whoa. Huh?
In the official report, which I found and is out there, the cause of the incident was listed as the frame of the window breaking and the glass falling out.
Oh my gosh.
So,
We
even
weren't
though
even testing for the right thing.
even though this is technically confirmed and really happened, it
wasn't the
actually
glass.
didn't happen the way this myth states. It was not stress in the glass. It was not any of that. Apparently, if the research that I did is correct, the wooden or metal, whatever frame around the glass broke and he fell out with the pane of glass.
That's wild. That's wild. That's also 10 times scarier to me.
But here's my question. Obviously that entire story is horrific and I don't want to make light of it in any way, but here's my question for the purposes of Mythbusters. Based on what we've seen previously, based on the previous myth even of the Biscuit Bazooka, when they said they could not find evidence of this actually happening,
Right.
they said it's busted. Essentially, they said
Yeah.
it's plausible, but the tone was this is busted.
Yeah.
By JATO rocket car rules, last week, even though you saw the car go down the desert,
Busted.
it was busted because it didn't really happen. We couldn't really find any record of it.
Right.
Does that mean this myth is busted? Because it didn't. Again, for our purposes, I'm fully on board with no. This absolutely. They took me on such a ride. This really happened.
Yeah.
But I'm talking about within the world that they have presented thus far. It feels like that's a pretty key piece of information, doesn't it?
It does. Because so much of it is about the glass itself.
Right.
I mean, they bring in a glass expert.
Right.
You know?
And also the idea of the frame breaking is even less of a question.
Right.
Like, of course, a piece of wood could break. Of
Right,
course,
right.
and that's a whole different, talk about weight distribution. Oh my God. If you're pushing a giant pane of glass against a thin wooden frame.
Apparently repeatedly.
Again and again, like that, to me, that's an even less of a question as to whether or not that would happen. But this just blew me away.
Yeah.
That the actual story they were telling apparently did not happen the way it was presented.
And I don't know why that wasn't. I feel like there would have been no problem in bringing that up.
Right.
You know?
Right.
That was like a part of it, is that they were testing for the myth.
Yeah.
They weren't testing for the story itself.
Right.
You know?
I wonder.
Easy, done.
I wonder if
it's
that was
weird
just
that wasn't
too complicated from a storytelling perspective.
could have been too complicated. Also, got to bear in mind this one was like 8 minutes.
Yeah,
which is wild because this is the one that stuck with me. But it was like the end cap. You know?
It comes back to the question we've asked multiple times already. How was this shot?
Yeah,
I really wonder if they shot the experiments, and then when it became a fully fledged TV show, they went back and did interviews, and in that process, that was their research process, and that's when they found out what really happened.
Right.
And maybe they realized, we kind of tested for the wrong thing, but it's so good.
Yeah.
We need to put it in the show.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I found that utterly fascinating that the show that we've seen thus far is based on these quote unquote real events. And did they happen? Did they not?
Now hear me out on this. I can see an argument made for not wanting to reveal any more details than you have to, considering the fact that this was a real tragedy.
Fair. That's fair.
I can see a vested privacy interest at play here that I would. I mean, again, we don't know without asking someone, but that makes sense to me to not get into the particulars of that, because ultimately that is taking a real life event, a real life tragedy, and turning it into entertainment. So divorcing it from the actual event to a certain degree, or at least making it insulated.
Right.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I can see an argument. for that.
It's also a case of what's the more interesting question.
Yes.
You know, is the question, even again, going back to the very beginning of the myth, I didn't think the question was very interesting of can glass fail, right? Anything can happen.
Right.
You know, the axle can fall out of your car randomly. It's not supposed to. You know, chances are 99 times out of 100 it wouldn't, but it can, right? That's not an interesting question.
Right.
They found the interesting question, which was what does it take to break glass under these specific parameters? And
Well
maybe
said.
in the end, that was just what they decided to go with.
Well
was,
said.
as you said, that's the myth, not the reality.
And that's the entertainment as well.
And that's the entertainment. And and obviously it worked.
Yeah.
But it's just so baffling given that tension in the show between the reality and the myth that they're playing with right now, that would be kind of a big miss.
It does seem like an oversight.
Yeah.
Only because it was so prominent and important to all the myths that we have seen previously.
Right.
But yeah, they're definitely still finding their groove, but I mean, they got like halfway there.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a lot of ground was covered in this episode.
Yeah.
So I'm interested to see if that will just be maintained or if in the third, it'll get even closer.
Well, we're going to find out next week. Our next episode is season 1, episode 3. It's the final of the 3 pilots. So we'll actually, after next week, we will be out of pilot territory. It'll be very interesting to see what changes come as part of that.
Yeah.
The myths are Larry's lawn chair balloon, Goldfinger, and the poppy seed drug test. And I will say in advance,
Fantastic.
I remember all 3 of these to some degree or another,
Okay.
and I think we are in for an awesome episode.
I remember none.
There we go.
But I can all but guarantee. Well, no, I have no idea. There are several things they could be testing for in Goldfinger. I think they are probably going to test for if it is plausible to kill somebody with the gold paint, or they could be testing for if it's possible to get sucked out of an airplane the way that Goldfinger does. That's a delightfully ridiculous scene.
Well, we will find out next week. And we want to encourage, once again, if you're listening to the show, please watch along.
Go
with
watch
us.
it.
That is
Yeah.
the whole point of this. We want you to try this at home. That is
Yeah.
why we're doing this. We want you to follow along with us and have this experience, because this is not like, you know, when we started out with this idea, you know, most rewatch podcasts are like scripted shows.
Right.
Right. And so people have a memory of the story and they have a memory of certain elements, and you can kind of go beat for beat. We didn't know how this was going to work because this is a documentary show. It's not this, you can't go scene by scene
Right.
in the same way. What's this going to be? And so watching along with us, I think is the other half of this journey. So you experience this as well and get to be
agree.
part of the conversation. But yeah, we hope you guys will join us next week, and we'll see you then.
Bye.
Try This at Home is produced by Slugline Media. The show is written, hosted, edited, and shot onto the internet by Cliff Bumgardner and Harrison Stewart. Our music is by the mysterious Breakmaster Cylinder. You can follow the show on Instagram at TryThisPod or email us, trythisathomepod@gmail.com.